Hey, this is Lance from LangChain. So we've been talking a lot about evaluation, and there's really four components we've been discussing. There is your application itself, there's a data set, there's an evaluator which takes your application's output along with potentially an output from your data set as a reference and produces a score, like a grade for how well your application is performing on the particular input example in your data set. So that's really the flow. And one of the things we've seen is that LLM-as-a-Judge evaluators are really popular. And the idea here is simply LLMs are really effective at judging for natural language outputs. For example, many apps like a RAG application will produce an answer in natural language. You want some way to judge that, potentially relative to reference, potentially relative to some criteria, and LLMs can be really effective at that. But a challenge is that you actually need to audit your LLM-as-a-Judge and you need to prompt it accordingly. And this is, potentially a real challenge depending on your criteria and your application. So what we've shown, and we just released a blog post today, is basically a way to align your LLM-as-a-Judge evaluators with human preferences or kind of your own criteria using a correction flow and capturing human corrections to your judge as few-shot examples that you feed to your evaluator. So that's kind of the big idea. Now, we came out with a video today showing how to use that with an online evaluator. So that is, if you have an application in production, you can take an evaluator that's running on your application's outputs or inputs, and you can improve it using this approach. But now I'm going to show how you can do the same thing on a data set. So let's just go over to a notebook here. So I've created a RAG bot. I've indexed 3 blog posts. I've already done this. So basically, here's my bot, and it's really simple. So basically, here's a simple RAG prompt. I'm going to be retrieving from my vector store, passing those documents to my LLM. I'll use GPT-4o. So that's kind of the setup. Now, we just went through in the past video how to set that up using an online evaluator, and now I want to show you how to do this using a data set. So oftentimes in offline evaluations, we run against the data set. So here's an example data set. It's some set of question-answer pairs from my RAG application related to my blog post. So this is, related to React. How does React work? And this is kind of the answer. And it kind of goes through. So I can just create this data set, and now this will be created over in LangSmith. I can go to LangSmith, and I can see I have this data set here. Here's my examples, inputs and outputs. So that's great. Now, here's a simple function that I'm just going to use to wrap my initial RAG bot. And really, this is only necessary if you want to, for example, change the output keys. And so what's going to happen is this function is going to take a dictionary in, which is an example from my data set. And it'll, of course, run my bot on the example, and then return the response, the response answer and the response context or documents as user-defined keys. That's all I'm doing there. Now, we've talked about this quite a bit before. Here is a baseline prompt for answer relevance. And I'm going to go ahead and define that. So we've gone through this before. This is using LLM-as-a-Judge to basically grade my answer as relative to the reference answer. And I'm using kind of a standard prompt to do that. And I can kick off evaluation here. Great. So that evaluation ran. I can go over to LangSmith. Now I see this experiment is logged to my project. I can see the aggregate score, answer versus reference score here, 60%. I can open this up. I can look at each one. So I can actually open this up. Here is the reference input. Here's reference output. Here's my model's output. And here is the grader score. In this case, the answer versus reference grader scored it as 1. So this is all pretty nice. And I can look at that for my whole data set. Now, if I go back here, we can go back and look at the bot itself very quickly. And we can see something that's kind of nice. When I return this invoke LLM, I get both answer and the context or the documents back out. So what that allows me to do, if I want, I can set up a more granular evaluation on just the documents themselves, which I may want to incorporate in my overall testing. As you can see, we only looked at the answer evaluation here, and we passed that in through the SDK, and that's what we're looking at over here. But let's say I want to do a little bit more. I want to kind of dig into some intermediate evaluations, and I want those to run, on all the examples that I pass through my evaluation. So what I can do is on my data set here, I can just add an evaluator. And you can see this add evaluator button. I'll call this document recall. I'll use GPT-4o. And I can use this suggested evaluator prompt here. And I can basically pick document relevance recall. So what's nice is this is basically going to default me a prompt that's going to grade the documents retrieved by my system. So that's actually pretty nice. So I'm going to do a few things here. First, I want to hook up my chain to my prompt. So for facts, I can just pick the output document. So we just went through and showed that our ragbot's going to return both the answer and the documents. That's really convenient for us. We can just grab the documents. And I can also just get the input question. So I'm going to grab the question from the input. I'm going to get the documents from the output of my chain. Those are going to get passed in then to my prompt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this few shot example thing. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but this is actually where I can inject human feedback to improve this particular grader. So here is the placeholder for that. So basically, this is going to be the facts, the question, the user feedback that I'm going to give the grader for anything I correct, and the score itself. So this is basically going to be the corrected score. And what I can add to my prompt is here are a few examples from grading to calibrate your answers, your grade. Let's just say that, to calibrate your grade. Now you're going to see this other thing that's pretty nice. You can actually select the number of few shot examples you want to add. So these examples are going to come from the user corrections. They'll be randomly selected depending on the number of overall corrections that are there. So of course, if the number of corrections is less than this number, then it'll just add everything. But let's say I went ahead and had dozens of corrections, it'll randomly sample 5 in this particular case. And one other little thing, I can basically set this output key of my grader to be any value. So it's actually pretty nice. I'll call this recall, and it's going to return a score of 0, 1 based upon my prompt right here. And it's going to have a placeholder for any corrections I make to this grader. So that's really all that's going on here. And I can actually preview it, so I can test and make sure that it's actually formatted correctly. And yep, documents and questions all get added. This is just taking an example piece of feedback. So there we are. Nice. So that's one of our evaluators. This will be for document recall. And I can add another for document precision. I'll use 4.0. Try an evaluator prompt, precision. So basically this is going to be the same as we did before. I can add this as a set of few shot examples. Nice. I'll call this precision. And I'll say here are some examples to calibrate your grading. And I'm just going to hook this up to my chain. So again, I can get the output documents and the input question. And that's it. That's all I need to do. So I'm going to save that. So now I have 2 graders tied to my data set for recall and precision. So anytime I run an experiment on this data set, those graders are going to run. So if we call, I ran my first experiment and it only looked at the answer evaluation. Now I have 2 additional graders that'll look at the document relevance and recall. So I have this all configured, and I can go back. I can kick off another run on my data set. Great. So our second experiment finished. And what's nice is we can now see that precision and recall are logged. So that's pretty cool. I can open this up. And now we can see 3 different scores are run for each of our examples. So again, this is our input question. We can even open this up here. Input question, reference output, and then LLM output answer. And we can see this was our original kind of answer versus reference scoring. Now precision and recall are added as evaluators pinned to our data set. These will always run every time we run an experiment. So that's pretty nice. It kind of gives us an easy ability to make sure that some diagnostic checks are run every time we run an experiment. So I can kind of scroll through here quickly, and I can see something kind of interesting. So here's a case where the answer is graded as incorrect, but the precision and recall of the retrieved documents are both graded as correct. So that's kind of an interesting and a weird case you would expect. If the documents are perfect, it's a bit odd then for our answer to be, incorrect. So I can open that up here. And I can look a bit more at the particular trace. So let's have a look there. Nice. And I can scroll down and look at the documents themselves. So here's the documents that we get out, right? So the question was related to the difference between react and reflection. And if I go down and look at the documents here, let's just have kind of a quick look. So the first document definitely references react. And let's just see if it really talks about the mechanism of action at all. Okay, so this is good. So it talks about react and reflection. The framework equips agents with dynamic memory and self-reflection. So this first document looks pretty good and relevant. Self-reflection is a vital part. So the second document does talk about react. The third document talks about reflection. The fourth document mentions React, but it really only mentions it in kind of a superficial way. It basically says React combines COT prompting with queries. It doesn't talk about reflection at all. So if you look at the other documents, either talk about reflection in some detail, or they talk about React, in reasonable detail. So what I might say is this fourth document, for example, I don't think really counts as a relevant document relative to the question of like the mechanism of action for React versus reflection. In particular, there's self-reflection approaches. So what I would do here is I think the recall is 1. So recall, again, is scoring whether or not any of the documents are relevant to your question. Precision is scoring are any of the documents irrelevant. So precision's kind of grading you negatively if any of the documents are spurious. And I think that's the case here. So what I'm going to say is, here, I'm basically going to make a correction, and I'm basically going to say the final document only superficially mentions mentions React, and does not talk about the self-reflection mechanism. So we should not score it as a 1 for precision. So that's it. I can update this. I can add this as feedback. And so there we go. So I've updated my grading. I've added feedback. And now we can go to our evaluators here, and we can go document precision. We just say edit. And we can go and see this few shot data set. We can open this up. And we can see that this now contains the correction we just made. This is pretty nice. So here's the updated score. And here's the explanation. So what's cool here is if I go back, this will now get sucked into my prompt as one of these few shot examples. And it's going to be added right here. And I can even see that. So I can hit this preview button, and I can see that this few shot example should be added. And let's just make sure. Yep, there it is. The final document only superficially mentions React. So we're going to score it as precision 0. So there we go. Go out. So now what I've done is I've corrected my evaluator for precision based on one of the grades. And I've added that now as an example to the grader. So for future iterations, it should capture that feedback and hopefully calibrate its outputs based on my user-defined feedback. So I now can go back. Now let's say I run a future pass of this particular experiment. So we can see our experiment ran. I can open it up. And I can go ahead and check. Now let's look at that third question. Was the difference between react and reflection? Now you can see here the evaluator is calibrated. Now the precision is actually scored as 0, which is what we would expect, and that's what we added to the feedback. So again, let's just open that up and see the expanded view. So we can see, here's the question, here is the reference answer, here is our model output, and our document retrieval precision now is graded as 0. We can even open that further. We can look at the trace, and again, it's the same, probably is the same 3 documents that were retrieved. Yep, exactly. So this fourth document is what we deem to be irrelevant, and it looks like our evaluator feedback has been captured, and now our evaluator has been calibrated accordingly based on our feedback. So again, if we pull all the way back up, what's really going on here? What we've done is we've set up a RAG agent, or in this case, actually, it's more like a simple RAG chain. We've set up a RAG chain. We've run evaluations with our RAG chain on a data set, and we've pinned 2 evaluators to our data set, one for document precision, one for document recall. And we had a look in the second experiment at the outputs of those evaluators. We graded them. So we said, okay, here's some cases where, in our case, we didn't like the fact that it graded the precision as perfect in a case where some of the documents were not particularly relevant to the question. We modified the grade, and we updated our evaluator such that that feedback is actually rolled in, and you can see right here, as few-shot examples. And so it basically calibrates our LLM-as-a-Judge evaluator based upon feedback that we're giving it. And so it's a really nice tool. We can use it with online evaluators like we just showed. And here we actually show that we can use it with data sets as well. So for offline evaluation with data sets in LangSmith. So it's a very nice tool, and it's particularly useful in this case of LLM-as-a-Judge evaluators, which just through prompting alone can't always capture all the human preferences that you have. The ability to add feedback with explanations significantly enhances your ability to kind of customize these LLM-as-a-Judge evaluators.